Okay. So thank you, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning to some of you. Thank you for joining us for this first webinar in our four-part series outlining the results of our Food Hub feasibility study. My name is Matt Keene. I'm a registered dietitian. I am the local foods program manager here at Cornell Cooperative Extension in Saratoga County. Before I did this work, I was the assistant school lunch director in the Saratoga Springs City School District for 5.5 years. And prior to that, I worked at the Department of Health down in Albany. I oversaw SNAP Ed curriculum and worked in the HIPNAP program, which helps to fund the food banks throughout the state. This study was funded by a 2021 Local Food Promotion Program grant, which runs through the USDA. So what we're looking at with this is just asking a basic question of, is the creation of a food hub in this area a good idea? To test this idea, funds were included to create a proof of concept food hub. And through that proof of concept food hub, we would provide local foods for K-12 schools, which we will be talking about today. In later webinars, we'll also be discussing how food access and sustainability fits into this. And sustainability in the sense of, if infrastructure expansion were to happen in this area or elsewhere, what does that look like? What's the environmental impact? And how could we make those two work together? For this proof of concept food hub, we focused on three areas: procurement and distribution, bids, and 30% assistance. For anybody who is not from New York State or unfamiliar, there's a program in New York State called the 30% Initiative. And through this program, school districts that spend 30% or more of their food dollars just at lunch, if they can spend that much, they get an extra 19 cents reimbursement back from the state for each meal served. The goal of concentrating on these areas is to make it as easy as possible for everybody involved, from the food service directors to the vendors. And this will be a theme throughout this webinar series of making it as easy as possible for everyone involved to get their foods to market and to make it so that this fits in with whatever their business practices are. So starting off with procurement and distribution, through the proof of concept food hub, we offered order aggregation, last mile delivery, 30% tracking and planning, that's that New York State program, and geographic bid creation for K-12 food service directors. The order aggregation took the form of essentially a shared spreadsheet. There were 7 school districts that agreed to be part of this study, and I had a spreadsheet with items that were available to them through local vendors. All they had to do was put their orders into those spreadsheets. I would order the food on their behalf. I would have it shipped to a central location and then do the last mile delivery from there. That central location was the Schuylerville Central School District, who agreed to let us use their cooler and freezer space as a drop site. For the 21-22 school year, the deliveries started in December. And what we focused on was frozen produce and frozen meat. We did that order on a monthly basis. And then for fresh produce, we did that order about every 2 weeks or so. This built on the work of the food service directors in the area. They were doing essentially the same thing, but doing it amongst themselves. So they would get together and aggregate their own orders. They would then place the order. It would be delivered to a central location. And then from there, they would either drive to that central location or figure out some other sort of distribution means to get the food. And for anybody who's worked with food service directors, you know that they have incredibly limited time. So the idea behind this was to take that work off their plate so that they could go about the business of running their food service department. For anybody who's considering doing something similar, there are certain things to consider with this sort of program. The first is vendor and K-12 relations. So knowing who the vendors are in the area, establishing good relations with them, and then the same thing for the food service directors in the area. Because of my previous work, this was something that was kind of already embedded. I had good standing relations with the local vendors. I knew what foods were available because I was the buyer for that district. And then also the food service directors, we all worked in the same sphere. I knew all of them. So having that relationship was made it easier for me to jump in and just start to hit the ground running. There are a couple other things to consider with this as well, like the ordering procedure. That being, what is the school calendar and when do they want orders? Like I said, we had built into this grant delivering about every 2 weeks or so. But when you get to Thanksgiving or when you get to Christmas, that changes quite a bit. So checking in with the food service directors and finding out during those times when they want deliveries to make sure that you're all on the same page and everybody can get the food that they need. And outside of that, looking at the actual delivery times. Delivery before lunch starts is always ideal because once the kids start coming through the line, things get a lot more hectic. It's difficult for the cooks to step away from whatever they're doing and check in the food. It's difficult to check through the food and make sure it's the quality that you want and to check off all the invoices. It just gets really hectic. So typically the earlier the better for food service directors. And then the last thing for this is food safety training. Knowing good food handling practices and temperature requirements if you're going to be moving food around, especially any food that's potentially hazardous, like food that's cold or frozen, or food that has been cut. In the very beginning stages of this study, about day 3 or so, I was made aware of an organization operating in this area called Comfort Food Community. Now, they were in the beginning stages of creating a food hub about 5 miles down the road from the proposed site of the food hub that we were looking to study. And that being the case, the hunch was just that doesn't make sense. Two organizations 5 miles down the road, if we were to do that, both of them will probably go out of business. So we had to take a step back and just continue to do the proof of concept food hub, but then see where else this leads us. And taking a step back, looking at some of the research, one of the things that I found was there was a study done that set population thresholds for the financial viability of a food hub. They looked at county lines because county data is easier. It's pretty easy to ascertain. And what they found was a population of about 820,000 people is enough to sustain one food hub. To sustain two food hubs, however, you need a population of about 500,000. So what Comfort Food was looking at doing with being a traditional food hub, aggregating local foods, delivering it to the local businesses, looking at about a 30-mile radius, that encompassed pretty much all of 3 counties, Warren, Washington, and Saratoga counties. The combined population of those 3 counties is 354,000. So knowing that, that kind of solidified that these two organizations would not be able to work together. Like there's already a permanent organization in the beginning stages of creating this food hub. So why not shift the focus to utilizing that proof of concept food hub and assisting them with getting their farm to school program running, um, and looking also at the market share in this area. There were other food hubs and other distributors that were operating in this area. So that market share was smaller than the 354,000 population. So this lays out the food that moved from year to year. And this was a 2-year study. We began delivering food in December of 21. So from December of 21 to June of 22, pretty much all of the deliveries that were done through CCE. In that time frame, we moved about $34,000 worth of food and about 12,500 pounds. The next year, we started working more with Comfort Food to essentially have conversations with them and say, would you be interested in transitioning some of these duties to you? Would you be interested in taking on some of the order aggregation, some of the last mile delivery, and just kind of see how it works for you? They agreed, and during the 22-23 school year, CCE right here, we only delivered from September through December, and in that time frame, we did about $45,000 worth of food and about 9,700 pounds. Comfort Food, through the whole school year, delivered about $81,000 worth of food and 48,000 pounds. Now, this chart over here shows the breakdown of who delivered what. And as of December was the last order that I did. So come January, that little blue line was an order that was in December that just happened to be delivered in January. But come January, all of the duties of the order aggregation and the last mile delivery and everything to do with the vendors and the K-12, that was in the hands of Comfort Food, and they delivered throughout the rest of the year. The combined total for that for the 22-23 school year for us was $126,000 worth of food and about 57,000 pounds. So we went from about $34,000 to $126,000 in a year time frame. This was also done through some trainings with Comfort Food to, again, try to help them expand and grow what they were already doing, but utilizing the the criteria mentioned before about the food handling, what the directors need, how to go about the orders and such. One of the other things we wanted to look at was also the cost of this. Again, for anybody who is looking at potentially doing something similar in their area, you need to know what it costs, or you're just, it's not great to throw something at the wall and hope you can actually pay for it. So here's what we found with our deliveries. This chart on the left, this was the 21-22 school year, which was just us, just CCE delivering the food. One of the things I want to point out here is the hours involved. For each delivery, I included 3 hours worth of administrative time. Now, that is a high estimate, considering that I didn't have to go through the vendor relation piece of it and the K-12 relation piece of it because I already had that background. If you're looking at starting something new, there's going to be some of that time built into this. So I wanted to aim high and just say about 3 hours worth of administrative time. But as you get going and as you get into a routine with this, that number would decrease. That within these 12 hours, this is also including the drive time and the time to load and unload the food. Now, these are monthly averages, and you can see the dollar amount of food that was moved, the pounds of food that were moved. The full-time equivalent works out to about a zero point 0.1 FTE. And for the cost of that, I just put in if that person were making $65,000 a year, that's what you would pay them to do this work. These are miles driven, the amount of gallons that we use to drive those miles, and then the van rental. This was also built into the grant. We put in $250 a day for a refrigerated van rental, and that was brought out through just talking to some of the van rental companies in the area, just to kind of see what a daily rate for that would be. So it worked out to about $500 for the month. Monthly average is about $930. Shifting to the 22-23 school year, this is when Comfort Food really started to take over a lot of those duties and where that transition happened from CCE to Comfort Food. And all of these are the same. It's still 6 hours per delivery, 6 hours of administrative time, excuse me, per delivery. And looking at CCE's expenses, it's pretty similar, $941 a month. Comfort Food was about a little over $1,000 a month. One thing to keep in mind with this, though, is that Comfort Food was moving more food than just this. This is what they moved for grant purposes. This is what I had access to for the information. So this is only what they move for K-12. This does not include any of their other customers. This also does not include purchasing the food. I was looking at this from the viewpoint of myself, which is an intermediary, where we help with the administration of it, with the orders and the last mile delivery, but we're not actually purchasing the food. That would be an added expense, but then you'd also be able to add in a dollar value for revenue for that as well. And with the sharing of duties here with those deliveries, we were also making inefficient deliveries because I was um, delivering certain foods and then Comfort Food was delivering certain foods. So I might go out to 3 or 4 districts on a Monday, and then Comfort Food might have had their deliveries for those districts on a Wednesday. If you had that combined within one organization, you would be doing one delivery instead of two. So this combined average here would be lower because of that efficiency. It's only a little bit higher because those deliveries were split up. And then you can see Comfort Food from January to May. This is when they were taking on all of the duties. It's pretty close to what the 21-22 average was. So I would say for anybody looking at this sort of thing, $1,000 a month or so is a reasonable expectation for providing these sorts of services. The next thing I want to talk about is bids. Now, I will not go into depth with this part of it. Just know that this is the information that K-12 schools have to work with. They all run through the USDA National School Lunch Program, but each state kind of interprets the guidelines a little bit differently. So always check in with whatever state agency you work with to make sure that this is still following their procedures. There are, in New York State, there are three basic guidelines for bidding. There's a formal bid, which is anything $20,000 or more. So if I'm purchasing milk for the year, I put out a milk bid, I say that's going to be $25,000. So we have to do a formal bid. What that entails is having all the legal language in a packet with the items that you want. You send that out to the public. You have to advertise that to the general public. The vendors put in their quantities or put in their estimates, and then they send that back. It's sealed up, and you are not allowed to touch it until the specified date and time that you said you were going to open those bids. You open them all at once, and you have to invite people along, the vendors along, if they want to come, just to kind of show fair play. So that is a cumbersome process. If you don't have to spend that much on food, there is the small purchase threshold, which is $3,500 to just below 20,000. And for that, all you need to do is get 3 quotes. That can be through email. You can just email somebody, keep that email for your records, and say, here are the 3 quotes, this is what we're purchasing. The other one is a micro purchase, which is anything $3,500 or less. There are some stipulations with this, though. One of them is called share the wealth, which means that you can't buy from just one vendor. You have to buy from multiple vendors because buying from one vendor would be seen as limiting competition, which you're not allowed to do. These are all strategies for purchasing food. And when I was working at Saratoga, I utilized the micro purchase threshold for our produce because I bid it weekly. So what I did was I made a spreadsheet of all of the produce that I would be buying throughout the year, sent that out to about 4 or 5 different vendors and said, I will be bidding this produce weekly. And if you would like to be considered for this weekly bid, fill out the spreadsheet and get it back to me, or just send your price list by Friday at 9 a.m. If I don't have it by then you're considered a no bid. That took care of all of my procurement requirements for the year. This was done through checking with my state agency to make sure that this was being done correctly. Again, always check in with whatever state agency oversees the National School Lunch Program and make sure that it's being done correctly on your end as well. There is another strategy that can be used called geographic preference bids. This entails This essentially gives you a way to award foods outside of just looking at the lowest price. You can attach criteria to the sorts of foods that you want. It can be something like you need to be able to deliver to all of our schools, or we want this delivered within 5 days of harvest. Those sorts of things, and then you attach a weight to each of those criteria to say, well, column A is worth 5 points, column B is worth 3, column C is worth 1. And as the vendors fill out that form, they'll check yes or no to all of those. Whoever has the highest point total gets a 10% discount off of their pricing just for awarding purposes, not for what the district would actually pay. It's a way to build in certain values to purchasing local food, and it's a way to target local foods so that you don't have to go just by the lowest price. For the 22-23 school year, I wrote a geographic preference bid for the BOCES organization in our area. And for anybody who is unfamiliar with that, BOCES is essentially a state-run entity that helps out school districts. They have programs for business administration, for HR, for food service, and if districts want to buy into any of those modules, they can. It's a centralized administration to help decrease the cost. And so the BOCES in our area, I wrote the geographic preference bid for them, targeting mainly frozen produce and frozen meat. And through that bid process, there are some benefits to it. Everybody has a chance to plan. All of the directors, to be a part of this bid, have to give estimates of their quantities for all of these foods. So it helps them with their menu planning. But then any vendor who wants to bid on this gets a chance to look at the expectations for the market for that area and decide whether or not it's in their financial interest. If they do that and say, yes, this is good, then they'll write in their pricing and send it back. And then you open the bid and award it to whoever has the lowest price, including that 10% discount. This was used as a way to help guarantee deliveries to this area to help expand offers. Now, the way it worked for this bid was that Comfort Food actually won the bid, but they won it by purchasing food from another food hub. So Comfort Food is out here in Eastern New York, and there's another food hub, Headwater, out here in Rochester, in Western New York. Comfort Food bought some food from Headwater. Headwater delivered it to a central drop location, and then Comfort Food did the last mile delivery from there. So this is a way for everybody to benefit. Headwater gets a chance to expand their market in this area, and Comfort Food gets a chance to deliver that food, increasing their revenue as well. They were also able to use that as a bit of a springboard to start aggregating more fresh produce and expand their farm to school products as well. So having that bit of revenue come in, what allowed them to be able to expand in that way. And then, since there's a guaranteed delivery coming to the area, now you can open up the entire catalog if you wanted to all of those directors and say, here are the items that were on the bid, but these are the items that these food hubs have available. If you want to purchase those, you still have to go through your normal procurement process, whatever that happens to be for the dollar value, but it's a way to add revenue to Headwater, to add a little bit of revenue to Comfort Food, and then also to expand local food access to all of the K-12 districts in the area who are utilizing this sort of geographic preference bid. The idea behind the geographic preference bid and any collective bid is essentially to pool the buying power of these districts. And to illustrate that, there were two districts that I worked with in the area, Corinth up here and Hadley. And they were, prior to this work, they had difficulty in accessing some of the local foods because they were kind of either on the cusp or just outside of these delivery areas. And they weren't a very large district. So their orders were not very big, and they were a little bit further out than most of the delivery areas for the local foods. So it just wasn't financially viable for those vendors to go to them. By utilizing this geographic preference bid, we essentially took the entire area and used that as a market. So Corinth and Hadley, and there were a couple other districts there who were utilizing this local food, and because of that, they were able to actually receive these products that they weren't able to before. And one of the things I want to show, these are districts that qualified for that 30% initiative in the 21-22 school year. Now, ADPs up here is average daily participation. That's just the average number of lunches a school serves, or a district serves on a day. All of these districts down here serve less meals per day than Corinth or Hadley, and all of these districts received the 30%. The ones who are highlighted, I also want to point out that they serve less meals. They are further off of the major interstate, 40 to 50 minutes versus 14 to 18, and they spend less money on local foods than either one of those, and they were still able to qualify for this 30%. And I imagine that's in large part because they operate under Southern Tier BOCES. They have a geographic preference bid, and it's kind of an all or nothing thing where you say you have to deliver to everybody or nobody. So if you want access to this market, you have to be able to get the food where it needs to go. So it can be a really powerful tool for increasing access for these K-12 schools. The other thing I want to make sure of with this is that this is a 2-year grant. And I didn't want this work to just stop and everybody be left trying to figure out what to do after these services were gone. So I want to make sure that the program was sustainable and that it kept going after this grant was finished. The geographic preference bid is now in the hands of our local BOCES. All they have to do from year to year now is reach out to the directors who might be interested, ask them the quantities for the items, ask if they want to change any items, and then what criteria they want to attach to the geographic preference. So year to year, this should continue through our BOCES organization. Distribution, as I mentioned, is pretty much entirely in the hands of comfort food. So that's another spot where this can just continue and nobody's going to be left out in the cold. The more difficult part is the administrative assistance. There's not a long-term solution for that yet. The administrative assistance is what I want to talk about next, and it largely covers the 30% initiative. Now, because there are a lot of people from outside of New York State, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but if anybody is interested in going through this in more detail, please feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to get in touch with you and walk you through some of the documents that you'll be seeing in a minute. So the 30% initiative, again, is a financial incentive for districts to buy local foods. First thing you need to figure out is, for any district, where are you starting from? What did you actually spend on local foods last year? And what did you need to spend to qualify for the 30%? And then what is that gap? There are two main document types that you need to look at for this. There's financial and then backup. Financial is all of your revenue and all of your expenses. Well, all of your food cost expenses, broken down into different categories that then get put into the calculator. The backup documentation is essentially for the people that I'm buying local foods from, can they prove to me and to the state auditors that it's actually coming from a local source? So that entails product formulation statements, letters of attestation from the growers to say that we're not buying from a different state and bringing it in to then sell, and then production records from the K-12 directors. This is the calculator that's used to determine the 30%. And essentially what you do is you put in your food costs, and then you put in these different revenue sources. It will spit out a number right here, and that is the dollar value that you would need to spend to qualify for the 30%. This is tracking documentation to figure out the reimbursement rates and how that breaks down. Again, I'm not going to go into detail with these, but know that these are on our website if you would like to go and download these. And again, I'm happy to walk anybody through it if you would like to spend a bit more time doing that. So this just breaks down the reimbursement to federal, states, breakfast, and lunch. And then what I would do when I was working in Saratoga is I would have the vendor here that sold me whatever local food it was, and then the dollar value that I spent at each of those vendors, they would have the total down here. And then you compare that total back here to what I should have spent. I did this calculator on a monthly basis just to see if I needed to change any of my procurement to be able to stay on track. The one tricky thing about this is milk. Schools are required to serve milk at lunch and at breakfast, but you can't count the breakfast milk because the 30% only counts at lunch. So what you have to do is essentially the cooks and the food service helpers would do this. They would put in how many milks of each type were sold each day, and then what the price was per month. Usually milk is on a monthly price fix, and then that would give you a total. You put in the total that you spent on milk for that month. It would subtract this, and then that's the total that you can actually use on your 30%. Outside of that, once you figure out what did I spend, or an estimate of it anyway, and what is the gap, now you need to look at what items to target. Do you want to do center of the plate, meats and such? Do you want to do produce, or do you want to do a combination of the two? And what strategies do you want to do for that procurement? One is the geographic preference bit that we talked about. One is also shuffling of commodity dollars. Every district gets money from the USDA every single year to spend on commodity foods. One thing that you can do is put money into these two programs right here, the DoD program and the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable program. And that's essentially a way for you to buy fresh produce using USDA money. And I did this again when I was working at the district to help offset our produce budget. So I used that money to buy the produce that wasn't coming from New York State. And then I would use my produce budget to buy the produce that was from New York State so I could actually increase the amount that I was spending locally. Again, using the geographic preference bids, working with local farmers, and the food service director relations are all important parts of this. And then working with the food hubs. I liked working with food hubs when I was doing this because it's a single point of contact. The food hub is doing the aggregation work for you. They're the ones going out to all those farmers, compiling all the food, sending out one price sheet. And besides that, it's one purchase order. So for every vendor we have to write a purchase order. If I work with 10 different farmers, that's 10 separate purchase orders I need to write. But then I also have 10 separate people to keep track of any sort of issues, whether the quality was bad, whether something went wrong with the delivery. I would have to have all of that written down and make sure I was checking in with those 10 different people, which can get messy really quickly. So working with food hubs, I preferred because it is that single point of contact. It's a single purchase order. It was just a lot easier to work through issues that way. Now, through the efforts of Comfort Food and CCE, we were able to get two additional districts in the 21-22 school year to qualify for that 30% initiative. They are Hadley and Corinth up here. And one of the things that we did was Argyle and Schuylerville, this was their third year receiving it. We leveraged that because we knew that local food was moving there. We leveraged what they were doing and included those other districts because we knew that there was a market here. Let's just make the market bigger and essentially rope Hadley and Corinth into this market so that they can get access to food. So looking at what is already happening in the area so that you can use that as a way to pull other vendors in and to increase the access was one strategy that we used for this too. And then we surveyed the directors. We sent out a survey to 7 directors in the area. We received responses back from 5. 2 of them were Schuylerville and Argyle. They had already received that 30% initiative for 3 years. 2 of them were those 2 new directors from Hadley and Corinth, and then one of them had not received the 30% yet. One of the things with this survey is that the last mile delivery and the order aggregation were the most important tasks from what the directors say. What I also wanted to look at is for the directors who were new to the 30%, Hadley down here in blue and Corinth in orange, what did they find helpful? What did the new directors find helpful that the directors who had their routine down said like, oh, okay, well, we could take or leave that. And pretty much across the board, all of the tasks that we performed were useful to them. The geographic preference, again, kind of hit or miss for one, but that was a useful tool from the outside to be able to get access to the local food. We also asked them about the assistance that was provided with the strategic planning, geographic preference bids, and such. And the strategic planning, helping to shuffle around the dollars and figure out what food to target, where all this food's coming from, and how to get it to everybody is important, but also the geographic preference bid. And then the same thing for the new directors. They found all of those tasks pretty important. This one for continued assistance. What are you going to need moving forward? And this makes sense because 2 of the directors were already in their routine. They knew how to get the 30%. They didn't need any assistance. They just kept doing what they were doing. So it makes sense that these would be a little bit lower. They didn't really need help with the tracking documentation and such. But the directors whose first time it was qualifying, said that moving forward, we'll need help with these certain things. And what this suggests is that even after some training takes place and some back and forth with the directors, and even after they qualify, it still will probably take a couple years of guidance before directors become really comfortable with this is how I'm planning to achieve that 30%. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is farm to school as a market. As I had mentioned before, looking at a traditional food hub in this area didn't make sense because there was already a permanent organization here who was working on that. So taking a step back, trying to look beyond food hub feasibility and look more at what are the local food system needs. From being a buyer in a district and from talking to vendors and from talking to other K-12 food service directors, none of us had enough cold chain storage. We knew that that was kind of an issue anecdotally and through interviews with the vendors. So the idea came forth of what about some sort of cold chain storage in this area as a staging and aggregation point for local foods where it can be that central drop point for Comfort Food or whoever else to have the food delivered there, they would pick up and then do the last mile delivery to their customers. Now, in looking at that, we have to look at what are the available markets because the idea behind this is we have the storage space. The way it's going to make money is by renting out storage space. If there's not the volume of food there, then nobody's going to need to rent it. So you need to see what is the volume of food flowing through this area and who are the people who are actually moving this local food. Now, today we're talking about K-12, but there's also institutions like colleges and hospitals and the Emergency Food Network, which I know might sound strange to consider that as a market, but they move food. They move way more than local food, but they move a lot of food. And this could potentially be a way for the emergency food system, for food banks and food pantries to increase the efficiency of their distribution. They still need to move that food. It might be easier for them to stage it in certain areas and then have local delivery partners as sort of like comfort food or other food hubs who are already doing these local deliveries to then also deliver to the pantries. We will get into that more in the second and third webinars in this series. And then the last one is pooled purchase power as a market. The 30% initiative was first brought forth in the 1819 school year, but it was implemented, I believe, in either February or March, sometime late in the year. So districts didn't really have a chance to plan for it. If you received the 30% that year, it was because you were already doing it and it was more happenstance than it was planning. In that year, about close to $2.5 million was spent on local food from qualifying districts. Buffalo City Schools was the majority of that. I believe they spend anywhere from like $1.5 to $2 million on local foods annually, it seems like. So they made up a good chunk of that dollar value. Come the 1920 school year, this is the first year that districts were able to plan for this. In that year, they spent $5.2 million on local foods from the qualifying districts. Jump to the 21-22 school year, it was $5.9 million. But then if you look at all of the districts that applied, not all of them that qualified, but all of them that applied were up to $6.4 million. So between the 1920 and the 21-22 school year, there's a 14% increase in the sale of local foods throughout the state. Now, this obviously does not account for all districts. This does not account for all of the food because milk, by and large, is a local purchase for school districts, whether or not they're trying to reach the 30%. That's a dollar value that is not really included in this and one that'd be really difficult to figure out. Also, other districts are spending money with local vendors, but not necessarily applying. That's money that we won't see. So really what we're looking at here is an incomplete picture, but it's the best picture we have for the information that is coming into the state institutions that oversee the 30% initiative. Taking that and then looking at what does New York State actually grow? These numbers are from the 2017 Ag Census. They've been adjusted for inflation to be today's numbers. So New York State produces about $1.3 billion worth of fruits and vegetables on an annual basis. About a quarter of that is exported. Schools purchased, let's say, 0.5%. That's that $6.4 million number from the 21-22 school year. And keeping in mind that this number also includes milk and meat and other local foods as well. But for just ease of looking at a one-to-one, we're just going to look at that dollar value compared to the produce dollar value that's produced in the state. The average cost per student for qualifying districts to achieve the 30% was 42 cents. I made a data set for this that breaks down the 30% by region, by district, and does these calculations to figure out how much the districts need to spend per student per meal to actually achieve this. That information is also available on our website if anybody would like to download it and kind of dig into the details of it. But what I came up with was 42 cents. So on average, school districts would need to spend 42 cents per student per meal on local foods to qualify for the 30%. So taking that number, there are 231 million lunches served statewide annually. 231 times 0.42 gives you $97 million. That's the dollar value for every single district in the state to qualify for the 30%. That is about 7.6% of the total fruit and vegetable production, keeping in mind that there would still be milk, there would be a lot of milk, there would still be meat, there would be other things. So it's lower than that, but we're currently at 6.6% of this target right here. And the point of this is to show that there's lots of room for expansion of this market. So there is potential for much more food to be flowing throughout the state. And that being the case, that might make for a better case for these sorts of aggregation cold chain facilities, because then you would have the necessity for storage spaces that then could be rented out. The other thing with this is the collective bidding, essentially the pooled buying power. I looked at the districts that utilize collective bidding. So I included in that number everybody who is overseen by a BOCES organization. So anybody where BOCES administers their food service department. I also included Buffalo City Schools in this number because if the idea behind a collective bid is to pool the buying power to make an attractive market, Buffalo City Schools spending $1.5 to $2 million on local foods by themselves, like they are a market by themselves. So I included that in here just because there is no need for them to actually aggregate with anybody else. And then the districts that I knew operated under geographic preference bids, which in this case is pretty much just Corinth and Hadley. And what I found was that if you utilize some sort of collective bid, usually a geographic preference, but it doesn't have to be formal. It could just be districts getting together themselves to do this sort of aggregation, you are much more likely to qualify for the 30%. Between 1920 and 2122, you're about 85% to 87% of all the districts that qualify utilize some sort of collective bid process. And again, to show that, we'll go back to this chart to show how many under Southern Tier BOCES. These are not all the qualifying districts. These are just all of the qualifying districts that are smaller than Corinth and Hadley, which are the two that we were able to help qualify in this area. So there are a lot of small districts who were able to take advantage of this sort of collective bid process to then gain better access to local foods. And then the precedent of farm to school as a market, and the pooled buying power as a market, excuse me. The first thing I want to illustrate here is the 2010 Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. These are the new guidelines that all school districts have to follow if they're operating under the National School Lunch Program. And built into these guidelines are nutrition requirements. When these new guidelines were put in place, the nutrition requirements changed. And industry responded to that by changing their formulations, changing the product lines so that they could access this market. Collectively, K-12 is the biggest restaurant in the country. They all operate under the same guidelines. So what works in Colorado is the same thing that works in New York. So if a manufacturer can get their formulation right, they can essentially deliver to any school districts in the entire country. Industry responded by doing that. And we saw a similar thing with the 30% initiative here in New York State. When that happened, there were a few, but not many products that were being manufactured that included at least 51% of their ingredients from New York State sources. As the years have gone on, we have seen something similar with industry changing their product formulations, changing their lines to utilize more New York State product because they want access to this market. They know that districts are buying it, so they want to be a part of it. And the last one here is the Urban School Food Alliance. This group is some of the largest districts in the nation. It includes New York City, Seattle, Houston, Philadelphia. Most of the large urban districts are in this group. And they got together and said that we want to use compostable trays, but they're really expensive. They went to manufacturers and said, this is what we want. We want compostable trays. We want it at this price point, and we also want a say in the design of it. And industry, again, responded to them by essentially just giving them everything they wanted. They had a say in the design of it. That's what was created. They have a compostable tray that went from 12 cents initially down to 5 cents. And I know 7 cents doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about these large districts, that's every meal and that's every student. For anybody looking at replicating this or doing something similar or expanding upon what they're doing in their area, I just want to go over these potential strategies that could help. And keeping in mind that this study is looking at the financial viability of a cold chain warehouse and the effects of that on the local food system. Space would be rented to multiple organizations and industries for staging and aggregation of food. And the financial viability of that is dependent on the available markets and volume of foods flowing through the area. So we have to look at market size, market availability, and the consistency of that market. The proof of concept food hub that we set up here was a way to pilot these strategies to help increase the market and make it easy for everyone involved to benefit, to help remove the barriers that hinder growth, which applies to every market, and which further webinars will be discussing as well. So the order aggregation and last mile delivery, that by doing that, we were able to help meet minimums for these vendors, and then extend the range of food hubs that are further away, like Headwater on the western side of the state to Comfort Food on the eastern side of the state. We were also through that, that was a vehicle for accelerating the cooperation of these food hubs to have this food moving back and forth more reliably, which means that the markets here are not just left with whatever the local food hub can aggregate. They could now theoretically pool from different parts of the state. And also looking at Comfort Food doing that, using that to ramp up their farm to school program and to accelerate their own fresh produce aggregation services. And then looking at the collective bidding, this was a way, again, to pool buying power to make these markets more attractive for vendors and to help assist everyone in planning. People can look at this market and decide for themselves ahead of time whether or not it's worth actually accessing or not. This also helps to create consistency and reliability in the K-12 market. If these bids are going to be year after year, those vendors know that this is here, we know what this market is like, hopefully it can expand, but we know it's at least this. Without that bid in place, without those contracts in place, because that's what a bid essentially is, that market is a lot more volatile, and you could be left not really wanting to access it because it could then not really be feasible for you. And then the last thing is the administrative assistance. Now, this was more specific to the 30% initiative in New York State, but the concept behind this can be applied to any state who may not have something similar in place, because the idea was to lower the time commitment of these K-12 directors in their efforts to access local foods. There are many ways to do that through the type of bid assistance that we use. That is not specific to the 30%. And there are other ways to do that through like the ease of burden of paperwork, for one, to make the 30% more palatable to directors, but then also to take away that paperwork so they don't have to worry about it. They can go about the business of running their programs while they have help actually accessing this local food. In future webinars, we'll discuss how these concepts of removing barriers and making it easy for everybody involved apply to those other markets. And we'll be pulling that all together. And then at the end, showing solutions for what this could look like for infrastructure build out in the future. We will end there, and I will now take questions.
Feel free if you guys want. You can unmute yourselves to ask questions if that's easier than typing it into the chat, but you're also welcome to type into the chat as well, and we can read it aloud.
One thing, it looks like there's one thing in chat as well, just some clarity about Comfort Food. They're a nonprofit. They're a 501c3. They are also doing like food access as one of their missions. They're not just a corporation looking to do farm to school. Food access is a big part of what they do. And then this is something that was kind of built together and a way to help the districts in the area and help them also increase revenue. Do we have any questions in the chat?
No, I have no more questions in the chat.
Okay, so if people, can they unmute themselves? Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself.
Hi, Kevin Davidson. I'm a farm to early care coordinator in Binghamton. So we're trying to expand some farm to school activities into early care here in the southern tier, including local procurement. And as messy as that can be in K through 12, early cares are smaller, they're less centralized, and they're less uniform. Um, so Matt, or really anyone in this call, I was wondering if you have any experience with that, advice, and I mean, connections would always be great.
Now, when you say early care, are you talking specifically like Head Start and other daycares that might operate under CACFP, or just any sort of early care?
Really, any for our program, we're going to be starting with Head Start sites.
Okay.
Uh, but yeah, really any.
Okay. Let me think about that. So there are for Head Start, they operate under CACFP guidelines. So that whoever is running it would need to make sure that they follow those sorts of guidelines. But as far as accessing the local foods, that's one of the things where they don't have a financial incentive like the K-12 districts do. And I don't know if some of them operate out of K-12 districts. We had 3 Head Start sites in Saratoga that essentially contracted us to do the food service for them. We would include local foods whenever we can. I think one of the strategies there is, as much as possible, trying to find things that are seasonal, because they'll be a little bit cheaper in season than they will out of season if you're trying to get something that's processed. So having that be less of an impact on the finances of the food service department could be helpful. But then also looking at comparisons between these products for whatever you might be looking to target. Here's what tomatoes cost from the vent like Cisco or Aramark or whoever you might be getting your food from, compared to like what we can get it from for the local vendors. So that might be something to kind of start the ball rolling to see what products are even like financially feasible for these food service operations, because they notoriously run on a pretty shoestring budget.
We
I
got
think
3 more questions in the chat also. So one of is from Chris. I may have missed it, but did the schools have to take a minimum order?
Yes and no. The minimum order was now aggregated amongst all the schools. There was a minimum order for the drop site, and having that drop site essentially service 5 or 6 different schools makes it so that you just take all those schools together to try to meet that minimum order. That was a part of it where, and this is where I think the bids can be helpful, because we were doing this outside of a bid on that first year. And in doing so, for each delivery, we had to make sure that we met the minimums. And so I would have to kind of go back and forth with the directors and say, hey, we're close. Does anybody else need anything? We're going to be like $100 short or whatever. Or go to the vendor and say, hey, we're a little short. Would you be able to deliver? With that bid in place, there are still usually minimums, but there's at least a contract in place stating, yes, we will deliver on a monthly basis or whatever happens to be.
So the other question that we have is, can you share more about the compostable trays? For example, how can school districts access these trays? Thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Um, so we actually had compostable trays in Saratoga Springs I believe, I think we had it at I know we had it at the high school. I think there was one other school. There were 9 schools total, but we definitely had it at the high school. They there were companies that we went through. They're paper companies. Um, Hill and Marks is one, for example, but there are paper companies to go through that you can ask about compostable trays and what they cost, and then you compare them to whatever other trays you might be using. But part of the issue with that, we use the compostable trays, but we also use compostable flatware. The compostable flatware, that was a much larger volume than the trays, because we tried not to give out trays. We wanted them to use the plastic ones. We would have a company come pick that up because there's no municipal composting in Saratoga Springs. So we had to contract with a company to come pick that up. They had like, I think, bi-monthly pickups. We had to pay for it. And they would take it to their site where they could get the temperature hot enough to actually break down the flatware. We tried doing it in a small compost pile at the school that they already had going, and it didn't break down at all. It wasn't hot enough. Um, look for the paper vendors, get in touch with them first, find out what's available, and then also find out who in your area might be able to take this. I imagine that the trays might be a little bit easier to break down than the flatware, but I don't know what the specs of those individually would be.
So, and the other question that we have here is from Rita, and it says, who do you think will or should take on the administrative component of ordering and tracking that you mentioned in the future? Has there been any discussion around including some of this true cost accounting being part of the cost comparison of local versus commodity?
Okay, let me take that. Excuse me. Let me take that one at a time. Ordering. So the ordering actually, the ordering piece of it resides now with Comfort Food. They're the ones who are doing the order aggregation. So that has a permanent home in this area. The administrative component, that was the 30% piece of it that I was looking at. There are regional farm to school coordinators throughout the state that operate under Harvest New York that assist districts with this sort of tracking and such. They have all kinds of information in like an Airtable for here are the products and here's some of the documentation behind it if people want to utilize these. That is a good spot for it, but I know that still a lot of work. There are a lot of districts that haven't received the 30% yet, and which means that there would be a lot of directors to kind of help bring them on board and help with this. And I don't know how many farm to school coordinators, but it's a big job. It's a big job, and I think that's something that could be helpful, but more assistance would be needed for that to really get some of these districts up and running because there are a lot of them who want to try to utilize this now. And then the last part, the true cost accounting being part of the cost comparison of local versus commodity. Could you define what you mean by true cost a bit more, Rita?
Yes. One of the things that has really started to become part of the conversation around the cost of local versus the cost of commodity, with there being sometimes such a stark difference, is the idea of true cost accounting, where we're starting to look at putting a value on health costs of commodity foods and also environmental costs of commodity foods, so that when people are looking at, we could buy tomatoes for 30 cents a pound as a commodity, from a national vendor, or we could buy them for $1.50 a pound. I know those prices are totally unreasonable, but $1.50 a pound from a local vendor. But if we include the true cost of that commodity tomato, then they're actually both approximately.
So the third webinar in this series, we'll go over that a little bit, not specifically with commodities, but in local versus not, and to try to show some of the impacts of like the international trade system and the land use and that sort of thing. So there will be a little bit of that later on, but it's not specific to commodities.
Gotcha. That sounds great.
And for
really
anyone.
Impressed. Oh, I was gonna say, I'm really impressed by your calculators and hoping maybe you can keep adding more calculators for all of us.
That's not my calculator. That was Cornell's. I think that was Cornell's anyway. So for anyone interested, Kevin Davidson put in the chat the farm to school coordinator map and their contact information if anybody would like to get in contact with them.
And we have one more question too, and it was for group buying, could you explain last mile after the drop site?
Sure. So it was, let me see. So we aggregate the orders from 6 or 7 districts, let's say, place it with whatever vendors there were, 1, 2, 3. Those vendors would deliver to the central site. We knew what day they would deliver because we would be in contact with them. And then that's the day that I essentially went up and borrowed the van, the refrigerated van, drove that to the central drop site, picked it up from the freezer or cooler that whatever it was placed in, and then I delivered to all of the individual schools that ordered. So I would have each individual school's order with me and load up the van accordingly, drive out to each of these schools, and then deliver their food, drive back and drop off the van. So it was obviously work on my part, but that was kind of the whole point, was to take that work off of the directors and put it more in CCE's hands and eventually Comfort Food.
We have a few more questions that came up in the chat. on. We also had Josh here had mentioned that Comfort Food Community has also shifted away from the group buying model and now offers weekly orders based on previous products, fresh, frozen, and dry. But the next question under that is, where can I find the financial viability of a food hub information study that Comfort Food Community did, please? Wondering if my county has a comparable population size to make a food hub potentially viable.
Oh, so Claire, I have that study saved. It's part of it's actually in the presentation too. There should be a link in the presentation on that slide. The slides will be sent out, but I'll circle back with you and send you that study through an email. Just writing down your name here. Okay.
And then we had Christy put in the chat, true cost of food study recently completed.
So Cal's at Cornell apparently just did a study. So Rita, if you wanted to take a look at that link, it looks like there was some work on that. Any other questions? Yes, the recording will be sent out.
Yep.
And also, again, for anybody who wasn't here in the beginning, we will, because there's a lot of information here and I don't know what other questions people might have, we're going to just open up a room tomorrow from 12 to 1 again for kind of a debrief chat for anybody who would like to discuss this a bit more, or if questions come up, throughout the next day. So we'll send the link to that to everybody. If you want to join, great. If not, it's not a big deal. But I'll be there to answer any questions if anybody has them. All right. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. So we will send out the recording, we'll send out the slides, and a link to our website with the rest of the information on it that I mentioned. And then we'll send out the next meeting details next Tuesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.